I was walking home from work the other day, and it was dark already, and we work hard at Dalberg. And my neighbor was out under the street lamp looking for something on the ground. And I said, "What are you looking for?" And he said, I lost my keys. I said, "Oh, let me help you." So I put on my reading glasses and got down and looked around and tried to find his keys with him, and we were looking for a while. And finally I said, "Are you sure this is where you dropped them? Because I can't find them anywhere." And he said, "Oh no, I dropped them out back, but the light's much better here." Now that story is actually in no way, true, but it does illustrate a point. At Dalberg Advisors, we work with leading foundations and impact investors, philanthropists, big public sector donor agencies. And one thing we've noticed that they all have in common is that, in my opinion, and I'm going to be a bit contrarian, is that they're all inappropriately risk averse. Inappropriately because that's society's risk capital. Whether you're a impact first or finance first impact investor, or particularly a foundation that has money it can give away. In fact, Jeff Rakes, when he was director of the Gates Foundation, publicly wondered how can he get his program officers to take more risk. Somehow the culture of foundations becomes such that program officers don't want to take risks and they only want to fund impact that they can measure. Now that's a problem. It's a problem because, as you all well know, as leaders of NGOs, funders really drive the agenda, and they determine what gets done in the social impact space and what doesn't. And I would argue that this aversion to risk and this insistence on easy to measure impact, and I don't want to take away from what you said, Owen, because I think you're quite right that managing the finances is another story. There you do want to be really measurement driven. But when it comes to a squishy thing like what impact are we having socially, that's where I would argue that some more appetite for risk and some more comfort with ambiguity would serve the sector very well. Instead, you have an aversion to risk and an insistence on easy to measure impact, which I think distorts and limits our work as advocates, as social entrepreneurs, as agents of social change in two ways. First, it leads to what I call hurry up and scale syndrome. Second, it devalues and ignores the potential for really truly transformative systems change. So I'll take the first one, hurry up and scale syndrome. You know what I mean, yeah? That the idea is this idea scalable? How many of you have been asked that by a funder? Or I don't like this idea because it doesn't seem scalable. They're thinking about scale before they even know if the thing you're doing actually works, actually changes anyone's life, and that seems inappropriate to me. I think of impact as consisting of two dimensions, or a function of two things, breadth and depth, right? So breadth is the number of people you reach, the number of villages you cover, what have you. It's easily quantifiable and it measures scale. You can imagine, I'm a consultant, so I have to use a 2x2 matrix. I'm using one in my head right now. Breadth on one axis, depth on the other. Breadth is the easily measurable measure of scale. Depth is how significant or transformative or meaningful is the impact you're having on each and every one of your customers or beneficiaries or whatever you call it. And because of the interest in scaling up quickly, I think that we overemphasize breadth, sometimes to the detriment of depth of impact. We end up scaling things that really aren't that meaningful. They're nice, but they're not quite meaningful. And things that are, we prioritize the cheap and easy over the possibly more expensive, but more transformative and more lasting impact that we might have because of this. A very good example, a nonprofit that I worked with recently that makes a solar package, very cheap, not terribly cheap, but a very robust solar lighting system that it gives out to rural health clinics, maternal clinics particularly, in rural Africa and South Asia. And they're struggling to get funding because funders say, we can't measure. We kind of know it's important to have light, duh, but we can't measure how having light in the clinic leads to decreased child mortality, or whatever their metric is. We can't draw a straight line. even though it's patently obvious that if you don't have lights, none of the other interventions really work. A midwife can be trained very well, but if there's no light to see, if she's holding a flashlight in her mouth, there are going to be mistakes made, right? So that insistence on measurability prevents us from doing things that are perhaps more innovative and addressing more fundamental problems. The second issue is ignoring the potential for more systematic change or systemic change. You know, we shy away, funders shy away from things that are harder, more expensive, more complicated, and less certain in terms of the impact, but which ultimately might have more, which are more ambitious and ultimately might be more game-changing. A great example of that is advocacy. I can tell you, just looking at the websites, if you go to a random selection of foundations and look at the section that says what we fund, many of them will have a statement that says we don't fund advocacy because we can't tell if it works and we don't like politics. I'm based on the West Coast of the US and they really don't like politics there. And in fact, just an aside, I think that one of the reasons or one of the contributing factors for this risk aversion, ironically, is that a lot of the money is coming from philanthropists who made their money in tech. And so they saw, you know, this. They saw how this changed the world very quickly, almost overnight. On my way here, sitting in traffic, apologies for being late, my Lyft driver told me there's now 3 times as many ride-sharing cars out there on the streets of Manhattan than there are yellow taxis. So overnight that happened. And they want that. And ironically, they've become risk-averse. These great, tremendous risk-takers in industry have become risk-averse in their philanthropy. And so things like advocacy, working on governance issues, which are very fundamental, working on culture change, which is almost a no-no to even talk about, are things that funders shy away from for just this issue. And we struggle. You know, you all are working on the front lines of these issues and see the need for systemic change, but it's hard to bring funders along. So the question becomes, what can we do about it? I think 3 things come to mind, and I'd love to hear your ideas if we have the time. First is call your funders on this. You know, explain to them that what you're doing, yes, has impact, but you could have much greater impact if you were collaborating with others, if you were advocating for policy change, culture change, what have you, and explain why that works. I think the more we give that message to funders, the better off we'll be, and the more they'll eventually come along. You know, I'm reminded of a quote from a Brazilian bishop or cardinal years ago, liberation theologian, who famously said, when I help the poor, when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist. And it's a little, we're having the same conversation with our funders over these years. If I feed the poor, if I create an app, you know, if I do something that directly, but perhaps even in a small way, affects the lives of the poor or whatever, they call me a saint and they write me a check. If I say, let's not do that, let's take a step back, work with the government, work with communities to do something more ambitious, but perhaps more ambiguous, they're not going to call me a communist anymore, but they may not write me a check. So 1, call the funders, engage the funders in this conversation. The more they hear, I think the more flexible they'll become. 2, to the extent you can, try to quantify the unquantifiable. If you can quantify the impact or the projected impact, expected impact of a systems change approach or an advocacy effort, that's helpful as well. It gives them the numbers they need to show to their bosses. It gives them a target for their reporting purposes, and that's doable. Dalberg has been working with a number of nonprofits, CARE and others, on a methodology for evaluating advocacy efforts and seeing whether they're having impact or not. 3rd and finally, try to quantify depth of impact. It's very easy to say we're reaching X number of villages, we've helped X number of kids, but to the extent we can quantify the depth of impact and talk about it in those terms and how we're not only reaching more kids or more kids are graduating school or more acres of parkland have been saved, whatever it is, find a language to talk about and quantify the depth of impact, how meaningful and lasting it is for each hectare of parkland saved or each child that you work with. And if we start to shift the conversation, I'm confident that over time our funders will come along with us. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to take your questions.